So for the last decade, data residency was pretty straightforward. You made sure your data physically sat on a server inside your own country, and that used to be enough. It was a bit like renting a hotel room. But now, with sovereign AI, nations and corporations are realizing they can't just rent a room. They can't borrow an extension cord off the big foreign tech giants either. They have to build the whole hotel, the plumbing, the staff, the land it sits on. And that realization is creating what is called the sovereignty trilemma. It's this impossible little situation where you find out you can't have it all. You have to pick your battles. Here's why. You cannot, all at the same time, maximize domestic control, build global frontier-level AI, and keep everything perfectly lined up with your local regulations. You get to pick two. Because if you restrict your AI to only train on perfectly secure, domestically approved data, you just don't have the sheer volume you need. And to get those bleeding edge capabilities, you need massive global supply chains and globally sourced data sets, which then forces you to give up some of that domestic control you wanted in the first place. So you have to choose what actually matters to you. Okay, so let's say a country decides, fine, we'll sacrifice capability and go all in on control. They still hit a massive physical wall because the smaller players are getting locked out of the semiconductor supply chain entirely. It's a literal scarcity problem. And to give you a sense of the scale, NVIDIA's sovereign AI-related revenue derived from selling hardware and software packages directly to state-backed data centers and national research supercomputers tripled year over year to exceed $30 billion in 2025. And here's where it gets really interesting to me, because I get stuck on the physical reality of it. Even if a country magically gets hold of those chips, how do they actually run them? That's the real bottleneck. Legacy data centers, cool, what? Maybe 10 to 15 kilowatts per rack? How on earth do they survive the 140 kilowatts of heat coming off one of the new NVIDIA Blackwell racks? The servers would literally melt. Air cooling is just physically impossible at that density. So it's forcing this huge, very expensive shift to direct liquid cooling. And running those liquid cooling systems takes even more power on top of everything the chips are already pulling, which triggers something even more awkward, a severe time to power mismatch. You can physically build an AI data center in 2, maybe 3 years, but connecting it to the grid, 4 to 10 years just to get approved and plugged in. So to get around that gridlock, big tech is skipping the public utilities altogether. They're signing agreements for small modular reactors, actual nuclear power, dedicated, on-site, just to get these facilities online. And once you see how extreme the infrastructure demands are and how heavily they're dominated by a handful of US companies, it's no wonder foreign nations are panicking. The real wake-up call came in June 2026, the US export ban on Anthropic's more advanced models. It acted like a geopolitical kill switch. Foreign nationals were suddenly barred from the advanced models on security grounds. It proved your critical infrastructure could just be switched off overnight. And we saw the fallout straight away. France's intelligence agency dropped the US company Palantir and swapped them for a local competitor, Chaps Vision. They had to go and build their own car to keep the analogy going. And countries are using their own geography to do it. Canada is using its freezing climate to naturally cool its Kansal supercomputing lab, completely sidestepping that cooling bottleneck I just talked about. Singapore went cultural with Sea Lion because they worked out that the global models, mostly trained on Western data, completely miss the linguistic nuance of Southeast Asia. So sovereign AI isn't only about data security. It's about accuracy for your own population. However, if you run a business that leans heavily on third-party AI, you are staring down a serious liability risk. So let's unpack what this actually means for you if you're the one running the company. It's what I'd call the liability squeeze. Courts are increasingly holding the deployer of the AI strictly liable for the errors, copyright infringement, bad hallucinations, all of it. And the big cloud vendors, they quietly cap their own financial liability in the terms of service. So if their model hallucinates and it costs your company millions, you're the one left holding the bag. And right now, 91% of executives admit they have AI dependency blind spots. meaning they don't even know all the third-party models running inside their own systems, which is wild when you actually think about it. So, to protect themselves, companies are deploying sovereign AI entirely inside their own jurisdiction. They want a liability firewall, total visibility over what's running. But building that is expensive. Companies are accepting something like a 20% sovereignty premium to do it because you lose all those lovely economies of scale you get from renting off a centralized giant. You're hiring specialist local talent, managing your own bespoke hardware. That premium is basically the price of security, and that cost lands on the consumer in the end. So the whole global AI picture is fracturing from a centralized US monopoly into a federated, culturally distinct ecosystem, heavily fortified walled gardens, basically. Which leaves us with a genuinely fascinating thing to sit with. If every nation and every corporation successfully builds its own hyper-localized, culturally isolated, walled garden AI, how do they actually talk to each other? How do these independent systems communicate and negotiate in the middle of a fast-moving global crisis? That one's for you to mull over on your own. Until next time, stay connected,